Some betrayals begin long before anyone realizes they have started. And the most dangerous ones are the kind that grow quietly inside the trust of a family. For most of his life, Samuel Whitaker had built his world slowly and carefully, the way some men build houses, one beam at a time, checking every joint before moving to the next. He was not the kind of businessman who chased quick success or loud recognition. His reputation came from something steadier than ambition. People trusted him because he never rushed decisions and never cut corners, and over the course of 25 years that quiet discipline had turned a small delivery operation into a respected regional logistics company. What made Samuel different was not just his work ethic but the calm presence he carried into every room. And the truth was that people didn't simply respect him, they relied on him. His employees knew their paychecks would arrive on time. His clients knew that if Samuel Whitaker promised something would arrive by morning, it would arrive before sunrise. At home, that same steadiness shaped the rhythm of the Whitaker household. The house itself was not extravagant, but it was warm in the kind of way that made visitors feel welcome within minutes of arriving. Helen Whitaker carried that warmth effortlessly. She had always been the emotional center of the family, someone who could read the tone of a conversation long before anyone else noticed it shifting. Where Samuel brought structure, Helen brought balance. And together they created a life that felt quietly secure. Their son Andrew grew up watching both of them closely. He inherited his father's habit of observation and his mother's instinct for empathy, which meant he often noticed things other people missed. Andrew rarely spoke first in conversations, but when he did, people tended to listen. He had grown up around the company warehouse, walking between loading docks while drivers greeted him by name. And over time those drivers began to see him not just as Samuel's son but as someone who understood the same values his father carried. For 25 years the Whitaker business grew carefully, not explosively. Each new contract was considered, each expansion measured. Samuel believed growth should never outrun stability. That philosophy frustrated some competitors, but it protected the company from the kind of reckless decisions that ruined others. In the local business community, Samuel Whitaker's name became associated with something rare: reliability. When other companies struggled with delayed shipments or broken agreements, Samuel's operation continued running the same way it always had: steady, precise, dependable. Clients trusted him not because he advertised loudly, but because he never gave them a reason not to. It was during those years of quiet stability that Charles Whitaker became more involved in the family's orbit. Charles was Samuel's brother-in-law, Helen's younger brother, and he carried himself with a different kind of confidence than Samuel. Where Samuel spoke slowly and thoughtfully, Charles spoke quickly and convincingly. He had charm that made people comfortable almost immediately. Charles often praised Samuel's success openly. And people believed that admiration was genuine. He attended company gatherings, asked questions about operations, and occasionally offered suggestions about expansion opportunities. Samuel appreciated the interest. After all, family support was something he valued deeply. He believed loyalty within a family was something that should never need questioning. But Andrew noticed something small during those early conversations. Charles didn't just ask about the company, he studied it. He paid attention to contract structures, decision-making authority, and the details of how approvals were processed. At first it seemed harmless, the curiosity of someone who admired a successful business. But Andrew sensed a certain focus in those questions that felt more analytical than casual. Samuel, however, saw nothing threatening in it. He saw family. And for Samuel Whitaker, family loyalty had always been one of the few principles he believed should never require verification. The years continued passing with the same quiet rhythm the Whitakers had always known. Morning meetings, evening dinners, community events where Samuel greeted clients like neighbors rather than customers. Helen hosted gatherings where laughter moved easily across the dining room table, and Andrew watched his parents with a sense of calm pride. There was no hint of conflict inside those rooms. There was only the quiet confidence of people who believed the ground beneath them was solid. Looking back later, Andrew would realize something that no one in that house understood at the time. Trust can sometimes become the very thing that blinds you. Because while Samuel continued running the company with steady hands and honest intentions, someone else had begun paying attention to every detail of how that stability worked. Charles watched how decisions were approved, how contracts were signed, how authority flowed through the business structure Samuel had built over decades. He did not rush anything. And patience, when combined with ambition, can be far more dangerous than aggression. Months passed, then years, and the Whitaker family continued believing their life was exactly what it appeared to be, a stable home built on trust, discipline, and loyalty. But sometimes the quietest storms are the ones already forming just beyond the horizon. And what Samuel Whitaker did not realize yet was that someone very close to him had already begun studying how to take everything he built. Sometimes the moment that changes everything arrives quietly, without warning or drama. And the most dangerous betrayals often begin during the exact moment when trust feels most natural. Samuel Whitaker had spent decades believing that stability came from discipline, patience, and careful planning. His life had followed that philosophy faithfully. The company moved steadily forward, contracts renewed predictably, and his home remained a place where problems were discussed calmly and solved thoughtfully. Nothing in Samuel's life had ever happened suddenly. Success had taken time, and he had grown comfortable with the rhythm of that gradual progress. Then one ordinary afternoon disrupted that rhythm. And vulnerability entered the Whitaker household in a way no one had expected. The medical emergency itself was not catastrophic, but it was serious enough to demand immediate attention. Samuel collapsed during a routine inspection at the warehouse, a brief but alarming episode that sent employees rushing to call for medical assistance. Within minutes he was on his way to the hospital, and for the first time in many years the man who normally held everything together was suddenly the one being cared for. Doctors ran a series of tests throughout the evening. And while the results brought relief, they also came with strict instructions. Samuel would recover fully, but only if he rested. Stress needed to be limited. Long workdays were temporarily off the table. For a man who had spent his entire adult life managing every moving piece of his company personally, those instructions felt unfamiliar. Yet Samuel accepted them with the same quiet discipline he applied to every other responsibility in his life. Helen remained steady beside him, offering calm reassurance that the company could handle a few weeks of adjustment. Andrew visited often, watching his father's frustration soften into reluctant acceptance. They all understood something important: the business Samuel had built was strong enough to survive a short absence. But businesses do not simply pause when a leader steps away. And that is when Charles Whitaker stepped forward. Charles arrived at the hospital with the confident concern of someone eager to help. His voice carried the same supportive tone he had always used when discussing the company. He reminded Samuel that temporary adjustments were normal in situations like this. Companies needed continuity, he explained gently, and someone needed to oversee certain responsibilities while Samuel recovered. The words sounded reasonable. And more importantly, they sounded supportive. Charles suggested taking on a few operational tasks temporarily, nothing permanent, nothing dramatic, simply ensuring that the company continued running smoothly while Samuel focused on healing. He framed the idea carefully, using language that emphasized protection rather than control. Stability. Continuity. Those were the words he repeated most often. They sounded responsible, even thoughtful. Helen listened closely as Charles explained how certain documents might need to be signed so vendors and financial institutions would recognize temporary authority if urgent decisions became necessary. The paperwork appeared ordinary enough. But timing can change the meaning of ordinary things. Samuel was still recovering from sedation when the documents arrived. The hospital room was quiet, the atmosphere calm, and Charles spoke patiently as he walked through each page. He explained that the papers were simply precautionary measures designed to protect the company in case decisions needed to be made during Samuel's recovery period. Nothing about the documents suggested a permanent transfer of control. At least not at first glance. Helen noticed a subtle urgency in Charles's tone, though she could not immediately identify why it unsettled her. He was polite, attentive, and reassuring. Everything about his demeanor suggested that he was trying to reduce stress for everyone involved. And in moments of vulnerability, reassurance is often the easiest thing to accept. Samuel trusted family. He had always trusted family. So when Charles described the documents as temporary safeguards meant to maintain stability, Samuel saw no reason to question them. The signatures were placed calmly, the conversation polite and supportive. It felt like a responsible step taken during an unusual circumstance. The pages were gathered neatly once he finished signing. Charles thanked him for trusting him with the responsibility. Helen watched the exchange quietly, still feeling that faint sense of unease she could not quite explain. But Samuel looked relieved afterward, believing the company would continue functioning smoothly while he focused on recovering his strength. For several weeks, life slowed down in ways Samuel had never experienced before. He spent more time at home, taking short walks with Helen in the evening and occasionally reviewing updates Andrew brought from the warehouse. Charles handled day-to-day matters with confidence, providing reports that suggested everything was proceeding normally. From the outside, the arrangement appeared to work perfectly. The company continued running, and Samuel gradually regained his energy. But something subtle had changed beneath the surface. Charles attended more meetings than before. Vendors began contacting him directly for approvals. Conversations about company decisions started including his voice more frequently. These changes were small enough to appear natural, especially during a temporary transition. Samuel noticed them but assumed they would fade once he returned fully to work. After all, the documents he had signed were only meant to protect the business during recovery. Weeks passed, and Samuel's strength returned steadily. Soon he was ready to resume the routine he had followed for decades. The warehouse smelled the same when he walked through the doors again. Employees greeted him warmly, and operations appeared smooth. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing suggested that the structure he had carefully built over 25 years had shifted in any meaningful way. But appearances can be deceptive. And paperwork can quietly reshape realities long before anyone realizes it. Samuel would not discover the truth immediately. The realization would come slowly, piece by piece, as he reviewed records and noticed small details that did not align with what he remembered signing. Because the documents that had been presented as temporary safeguards carried meanings that were far more permanent than anyone had explained. And weeks later, Samuel Whitaker would discover something that changed everything he thought he understood about that hospital room conversation. Those documents had never been meant to protect him. Truth rarely arrives with a loud announcement. Sometimes it appears quietly inside a document you don't remember approving. When Samuel Whitaker returned to the office after his recovery, the building felt exactly the way he had left it. The warehouse doors rolled open at the same early hour, the drivers greeted him with familiar nods, and the hum of forklifts moving cargo across concrete floors carried the same steady rhythm he had heard for decades. On the surface, nothing had changed. The business he had built still moved forward with the same dependable motion it always had. But stability can hide small shifts that only careful eyes notice. And Samuel Whitaker had always been a man who noticed details. His first week back was intentionally quiet. He spent time walking through the facility, reconnecting with employees and reviewing routine reports. Charles appeared helpful and cooperative, presenting updates with the same calm confidence he had shown during Samuel's recovery. The numbers looked normal, the shipments were on schedule, and there were no obvious signs of disruption. For most people, that would have been enough reassurance. But Samuel had spent 25 years studying how systems worked. So when he sat down in his office one late afternoon to review the company's official filings, he approached the task the same way he approached every major decision, with patience. Stacks of reports rested neatly across his desk, and the familiar glow of the computer screen reflected softly against the glass windows behind him. It began with something small. A filing date that didn't match his memory. Samuel opened the corporate registry records and began comparing the documents against the versions he had stored in his personal archive. At first the differences seemed minor, the kind of administrative edits that happened during normal operations. But as he read more carefully, a quiet tension settled into the room. One document carried his signature. Yet the language above it was unfamiliar. Samuel leaned back in his chair, reading the page again slowly. The signature at the bottom was unmistakably his. The ink curve of his name followed the same steady motion he had written thousands of times. But the clauses attached to that signature had expanded far beyond what he remembered signing in that hospital room. Temporary operational assistance had become extended financial authority. Limited oversight had transformed into decision-making control over major contracts. None of it was obvious at first glance. The changes were subtle, buried inside paragraphs of formal language that looked perfectly legitimate. But Samuel understood those contracts the way a builder understands the beams inside a house. And this house had been quietly rearranged. He continued reading. Each page revealed another adjustment. Authority over vendor negotiations had been broadened. Certain financial approvals no longer required Samuel's direct authorization. Even internal reporting channels had shifted in ways that suggested someone else now held more influence than before. Samuel did not react immediately. Instead, he opened another file. Vendor communications over the past several weeks confirmed what the document suggested. Many suppliers had begun sending their primary correspondence to Charles rather than Samuel. Some emails still included Samuel as a courtesy, but the tone had changed. Decisions were now being requested from Charles first. That alone might have been explained by Samuel's recent absence. But the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Next, Samuel reviewed the company's banking notifications. His accounts had always been structured so that any significant financial movement triggered alerts sent directly to his personal email. It was a safeguard he had implemented years earlier to ensure transparency. Now those alerts were arriving through a secondary administrative address. Samuel stared at the screen for several long moments before opening the authorization settings. And there it was. The routing permissions had been modified through the same amended filing he had just discovered. The language allowed certain financial notifications to be redirected through the temporary authority structure Charles had described during Samuel's recovery. Again, the changes were subtle. But together they created a different reality. Samuel closed the document and rested his hands quietly on the desk. There was no anger in his expression, no visible frustration. The calm discipline that had shaped his entire career remained intact. Because Samuel Whitaker understood something important about moments like this. Reacting too quickly can destroy clarity. Instead of confronting Charles immediately, Samuel began doing what he had always done best. He reviewed every document carefully, comparing timestamps, filing dates, and contract language against the original versions stored in his records. The deeper he looked, the clearer the pattern became. These changes had not happened randomly. They had been designed. Some clauses had been expanded in ways that allowed Charles to make operational decisions without requiring Samuel's immediate approval. Others adjusted financial reporting procedures so certain activities could be processed more efficiently during Samuel's recovery. On paper, the reasoning appeared responsible. But the scope of authority had grown far beyond what Samuel remembered agreeing to. Still, Samuel said nothing. Silence, he knew, can reveal more than confrontation. He printed copies of the documents and placed them neatly inside a leather binder he had used for important records throughout his career. Each page was marked with small notes identifying the exact wording differences between the original agreements and the amended versions. The process took hours. But patience had always been Samuel's greatest strength. When he finally reached the final section of the amended filing, something caught his attention immediately. It was a clause that had not appeared in any earlier version of the company's governing documents. The language was brief but unmistakable. It referenced the temporary alignment of company assets under a secondary trust designed to ensure operational continuity during leadership transition. Samuel read the line again slowly. Because he had never created any such trust. He closed the binder quietly and stared out the window at the fading evening light beyond the warehouse yard. The authority changes were concerning, yes. But they were not the most disturbing discovery. The most disturbing detail was that someone had inserted a legal structure into his company that he had never authorized. Because buried inside those amended documents was a clause referencing a trust Samuel Whitaker had never created. Reputation rarely collapses all at once. More often, it is rewritten slowly, one polite conversation at a time. When Samuel Whitaker first noticed the shift, it wasn't loud enough to alarm anyone else. The warehouse still operated with the same disciplined rhythm it had always known. Trucks moved in and out of loading bays, drivers reviewed schedules, and office staff handled invoices with quiet efficiency. From the outside, nothing about the Whitaker company suggested instability. But perception has a way of changing before reality does. And sometimes the story people believe begins to drift long before anyone challenges it. Charles Whitaker had always been present around the company, but his presence began to expand in subtle ways. At first it seemed natural. During Samuel's recovery period he had stepped in to help manage operations, and some of those responsibilities simply continued after Samuel returned. Employees asked Charles questions during meetings. Vendors called him when they needed quick decisions. It didn't feel aggressive. It felt gradual. Soon Charles began representing the company at events Samuel used to attend personally. Regional logistics gatherings, supplier appreciation dinners, community business panels, Charles arrived with the confident professionalism people expected from a company executive. He spoke well, with the kind of polished ease that made audiences comfortable. And he never once spoke negatively about Samuel. Instead, he praised him. Charles described Samuel as a visionary founder who had built something remarkable over decades. He spoke about honoring Samuel's legacy and maintaining the stability Samuel had created. The words sounded respectful, even admiring. But admiration can quietly contain replacement. And people rarely notice the difference until it is too late. Community members began responding warmly to Charles's leadership. They thanked him for stepping up during a difficult time. They complimented the way he had stabilized operations while Samuel recovered. Most of those conversations were well-intentioned. But each one carried a subtle assumption. The assumption was that Samuel Whitaker was gradually stepping aside. Helen Whitaker felt the change before anyone said it directly. At social gatherings she noticed the tone people used when they asked about Samuel. Their voices carried gentle sympathy rather than normal conversation. Friends spoke about his health with concern, then quickly shifted to discussing how impressive Charles had been during the transition. No one meant to be disrespectful. But sympathy can sometimes replace respect without anyone realizing it. Helen remained gracious through those conversations. She smiled, answered questions calmly, and never allowed her unease to become visible. Yet she sensed something moving beneath the surface, something that made the atmosphere around her feel slightly different. At home she mentioned it gently to Samuel one evening while they sat together in the quiet living room. Samuel listened carefully but did not react with frustration. Because by then he had already begun noticing the same shift. Andrew saw it as well, though he experienced it differently. His work at the warehouse placed him in constant contact with suppliers and logistics partners. Over time he realized that more of them were treating Charles as the company's primary decision-maker. Some addressed him with deference usually reserved for the owner. Others asked Andrew if Samuel planned to retire soon. Those questions were not hostile. But they revealed how quickly narratives can spread. Andrew discussed the pattern with Samuel one evening after reviewing shipment schedules. Samuel listened silently while his son described the changes in tone and behavior he had noticed among vendors. Samuel did not express anger. He simply asked careful questions. What exactly had they said? How often were those assumptions appearing? Andrew answered honestly. The story seemed to be circulating naturally. People believed Samuel was preparing to step back and allow Charles to guide the company's future. Samuel nodded slowly. And then he changed the subject. To Andrew, that calm response seemed almost surprising. Many leaders would have immediately confronted the rumors or clarified their authority publicly. But Samuel Whitaker had never been a man who reacted impulsively. He preferred observation. Observation creates understanding. So Samuel continued attending meetings as he always had. He greeted employees warmly, reviewed reports, and maintained the same steady presence that had defined his leadership for decades. When Charles spoke during discussions, Samuel listened politely without interruption. Nothing about his behavior suggested conflict. But his attention had become sharper. Every conversation was noted. Every subtle shift in language was remembered. Samuel watched how Charles introduced ideas during meetings and how others responded. He observed the way employees gradually deferred to Charles when decisions required quick responses. And all the while, Samuel said nothing publicly. That silence confused some people. A few wondered privately if Samuel truly intended to step aside. Others assumed he was simply allowing Charles to prove his leadership abilities before making a formal transition announcement. But Samuel Whitaker had no intention of surrendering the company he had built with 25 years of discipline. Instead, he was studying something far more important than rumors. He was studying the evidence. Late at night, after the office emptied and the warehouse lights dimmed, Samuel returned to the documents he had begun reviewing weeks earlier. The amended filings, the altered contract clauses, the new financial routing permissions, all of it was carefully organized inside the leather binder resting on his desk. Page by page, he compared every line against the original record stored in his private archive. The differences became clearer with every review. Authority changes. Financial permissions. Trust language that had never existed before. Samuel wrote small notes beside each discrepancy, marking the exact wording that had shifted and the dates those changes had been filed. The process required patience, but patience had always been Samuel's greatest advantage. Because rumors can shape perception. But documentation shapes truth. By the time the community began fully believing the story that Samuel Whitaker had stepped aside, something very different was happening quietly inside his office. While everyone believed Samuel had accepted the transition, he had already begun documenting everything. People often assume silence means surrender. But sometimes silence is the moment when the real work finally begins. After the rumors began drifting through the community and Charles's presence in the company continued expanding, Samuel Whitaker did something that confused nearly everyone around him. He did not argue. He did not challenge Charles publicly. He did not attempt to correct the growing narrative that he was slowly stepping aside. Instead, Samuel became quieter. To employees and business partners, it looked like acceptance. Meetings remained calm, and Samuel continued reviewing reports with the same steady tone he had always used. When Charles spoke about operational plans or vendor negotiations, Samuel listened without interruption. From the outside, it appeared as if the founder of the company had willingly allowed the next phase of leadership to unfold. But appearances rarely reveal the full story. Late at night, long after the warehouse lights dimmed and the office hallways fell silent, Samuel returned to the documents he had begun studying weeks earlier. The leather binder on his desk had grown thicker with each passing day. Inside it were copies of contracts, financial filings, vendor agreements, and internal communications. Each page carried small handwritten notes in the margins. Samuel moved through those records slowly, comparing them against the original versions he had stored in his personal archive for years. The process was meticulous, almost methodical. He traced the language of every clause, noting where wording had been expanded or adjusted. Authority changes were rarely dramatic. They were incremental. Temporary permissions became extended privileges. Approval processes quietly shifted. Financial oversight structures gained new pathways that allowed decisions to move through Charles more easily than before. None of those changes appeared alarming on their own. But Samuel had spent decades building this company. He knew exactly how its structure was supposed to work. Andrew began noticing his father's routine changing. Evenings that once ended with relaxed conversations at the kitchen table now extended into late-night hours in Samuel's study. Papers covered the desk, organized into careful stacks. The glow of a desk lamp often remained visible beneath the door long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. Andrew approached one evening carrying a cup of coffee for his father. Samuel accepted it with quiet gratitude. He did not immediately explain what he was doing. Instead, he asked Andrew to help review shipment authorization logs from the previous 6 months. Together they examined the records, comparing them against vendor contracts and internal approval structures. Andrew soon realized what his father was building. A timeline. Every document Samuel had signed during his recovery period was placed at the center of that timeline. Around it, Samuel arranged the amended filings that appeared afterward, the changes to vendor communication structures, the redirection of financial notifications, and the subtle language shifts in contract clauses. It was not anger guiding Samuel's work. It was clarity. By the end of the first week, the timeline revealed something troubling. The amendments to corporate filings had not occurred randomly. They followed a clear sequence, each change expanding authority in ways that gradually positioned Charles closer to operational control. Samuel studied the pattern without emotion. Patterns reveal intention. The next step required discretion. Samuel scheduled a quiet meeting with an attorney he had trusted years earlier during the company's early expansion phase. The attorney's office was small and understated, located in a quiet part of the city where few business executives expected to find legal consultations taking place. Samuel arrived carrying the leather binder. He explained the situation calmly, presenting the documents one by one while the attorney reviewed the changes carefully. The conversation was professional and measured. There were no accusations, only questions. What did these amendments legally allow? How were authority structures being interpreted? The attorney reviewed the language closely and suggested something Samuel had already begun considering, a forensic financial review. Such reviews did not rely on assumptions. They relied on numbers, timestamps, and formal documentation. Samuel agreed. The review began quietly over the following weeks. Financial records were examined alongside the amended corporate filings. Transaction histories were cross-referenced with authorization logs. Each payment, approval, and contract adjustment was mapped against the timeline Samuel had constructed. The process remained invisible to the outside world. At the warehouse, Charles continued operating with the same confidence he had shown since Samuel's recovery. Vendors greeted him as the person responsible for day-to-day decisions. Community members continued praising his leadership. Meanwhile, Samuel continued attending meetings calmly, giving no indication that anything unusual was unfolding behind the scenes. Silence can make people comfortable. Comfort can make people careless. Andrew watched the investigation develop with growing understanding. At first he had assumed his father's quiet behavior meant he was trying to avoid conflict. Now he realized something very different was happening. Samuel was not avoiding the truth. He was preparing to understand it completely. Weeks passed while the forensic review progressed. Each new piece of evidence was added to the timeline, each discrepancy carefully documented. The attorney worked methodically, ensuring every finding could stand up to legal scrutiny if necessary. Samuel never raised his voice during that process. He did not confront Charles. He did not accuse anyone. Instead, he continued building the one thing that mattered most in situations like this: evidence. And the deeper the investigation went, the clearer the pattern became. What had first appeared to be a series of opportunistic adjustments now looked far more deliberate. Because the amended clauses, the redirected financial notifications, and even the legal language surrounding that mysterious trust structure all pointed to the same conclusion. The plan had not begun when Samuel became sick. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that the betrayal had been planned long before Samuel ever got sick. Sometimes the truth arrives slowly, piece by piece, until the final piece changes everything you thought you understood. And when Samuel Whitaker finally saw the full picture, he realized the betrayal had never been accidental. By the time the forensic review reached its second month, the quiet investigation had produced a detailed map of every financial movement that occurred during Samuel's illness and recovery. The attorney Samuel had consulted worked carefully, documenting each transaction with professional precision. Numbers rarely carry emotion, but when arranged in the right order they can reveal intentions more clearly than words ever could. Samuel studied each report patiently, because patience had always been his strongest advantage. The first discovery appeared inside a series of consulting payments that had seemed harmless when viewed individually. These payments were categorized under operational advisory services, routine expenses many companies maintain when bringing in outside expertise. But the amounts had increased steadily over several weeks. At first the numbers looked ordinary. Then the pattern began to emerge. When the forensic accountant traced the payments to their destination, the consulting entity receiving those funds appeared legitimate on the surface. It was registered as a small advisory firm specializing in logistics efficiency. The paperwork looked professional, the invoices structured carefully. But deeper analysis revealed something important. The entity was connected to Charles. Not directly enough to be obvious, but clearly enough to raise serious questions. Ownership records linked the consulting firm to a partnership group where Charles held a quiet financial interest. That meant the payments authorized during Samuel's recovery were not simply consulting expenses. They were financial transfers that indirectly benefited Charles. Samuel read the report slowly, absorbing the implications without visible anger. He had expected to find irregularities, but seeing the pattern documented with such clarity carried a different weight. The changes in authority he had noticed earlier were not just structural adjustments. They were part of a system that allowed money to move. But the consulting payments were only the beginning. As the investigation continued, another discovery surfaced within the corporate filing history Samuel had already begun studying. The attorney compared earlier drafts of the amended documents against the versions officially submitted to the registry. What they found changed the entire timeline. Several of the clauses expanding Charles's authority had been drafted weeks before Samuel ever entered the hospital. Those drafts existed in archived document versions created long before the medical emergency that supposedly required temporary leadership adjustments. Samuel stared at the printed report while the attorney explained the significance quietly. The changes had not been created in response to Samuel's illness. They had been waiting for it. That realization shifted the emotional weight of the entire situation. Until that moment, Samuel had wondered whether Charles had simply taken advantage of an unexpected opportunity. Opportunism would have been disappointing, but it might have been understandable. Planning was different. Planning meant intention. Andrew listened silently as the findings were discussed in the attorney's office. The quiet tension in the room carried a mixture of disbelief and clarity. Everything Samuel had built over 25 years had nearly been redirected through a system designed long before anyone believed it would be used. But the discoveries did not stop there. The next document the attorney reviewed was the medical certification attached to the authority amendment Samuel had signed during his recovery. That certification had been used to justify expanding Charles's operational control under the argument that Samuel might be temporarily unable to manage complex business decisions. At first glance, the certification appeared legitimate. But closer examination raised serious doubts. The physician listed on the document had conducted only a routine hospital assessment, not the detailed evaluation normally required for legal incapacity declarations. The language used in the certification exceeded what the physician's notes actually described. In other words, the medical document had been interpreted in a way that stretched far beyond its original intent. The pieces were now impossible to ignore. Consulting payments benefiting Charles. Authority expansions prepared before the illness occurred. A medical certification used to justify changes that had already been planned. Together they formed a picture that was far more deliberate than Samuel had initially imagined. For several long moments no one spoke. The evidence rested quietly on the desk between them. Samuel did not react with anger or disbelief. His calm presence remained unchanged, though Andrew could see the weight of the realization settling across his father's expression. Because understanding betrayal requires a different kind of strength. Samuel gathered the documents carefully, placing them back into the binder he had been building for weeks. Each page now carried greater meaning than when the investigation had first begun. What once looked like isolated irregularities had become a clear timeline of preparation. The attorney asked the obvious question. Would Samuel confront Charles immediately? Samuel shook his head slowly. Confrontation would only create denial and argument. It would turn the situation into a conflict of voices rather than a presentation of facts. Samuel Whitaker had spent too many years building a reputation for calm judgment to abandon that approach now. Instead, he chose something far more deliberate. Samuel closed the binder and stood quietly from his chair. His voice remained steady when he finally spoke, the same steady tone his employees had trusted for decades. He said they would let the documents speak. The next step would not be a private confrontation or emotional accusation. It would be a formal conversation held in a setting where evidence carried authority. Because Samuel understood something Charles apparently did not. When the truth is carefully documented, it does not need anger to be powerful. Samuel Whitaker did not confront Charles. Instead, he scheduled a meeting that would change everything. The truth does not need to shout when it finally arrives. Sometimes it simply walks into a room carrying a folder of documents no one expected to see. The boardroom inside Whitaker Logistics had hosted hundreds of meetings over the years, most of them routine discussions about contracts, growth plans, and operational decisions. The long polished table had witnessed negotiations, celebrations, and quiet disagreements that eventually resolved themselves through careful conversation. But the meeting scheduled that morning felt different before it even began. Because beneath the calm surface of the company, something decisive was about to happen. The official reason for the meeting was simple enough: a strategic review of leadership responsibilities and operational authority following Samuel Whitaker's recent health recovery. The invitation had been sent through normal corporate channels, and the agenda looked ordinary to anyone reading it casually. Charles Whitaker walked into the room with quiet confidence. He believed the meeting would confirm what everyone had already started to assume. For weeks, the community had been speaking about him as the company's emerging leader. Employees were accustomed to bringing operational decisions to him, vendors expected his approval on contracts, and even board members had grown comfortable hearing him present updates. Everything pointed toward a formal transition. At least that was what Charles believed. Samuel Whitaker entered the boardroom a few minutes later carrying the same leather binder he had been building for months. His expression was calm, almost reflective. To anyone who did not know him well, he appeared simply prepared for another business discussion. But Andrew, seated quietly near the far end of the table, understood something important. Samuel had not brought that binder for routine conversation. The board members settled into their seats, greeting one another politely as they prepared to begin. Charles took his usual position near the center of the table, reviewing the notes he had prepared to present. He planned to outline the operational adjustments he had managed during Samuel's recovery and explain how those changes could continue benefiting the company moving forward. Samuel listened quietly while the meeting opened with the usual formalities. He did not interrupt. When Charles finished describing the company's recent performance, several board members nodded approvingly. The results were strong, and the company had remained stable throughout Samuel's absence. Charles concluded his remarks by emphasizing the importance of maintaining continuity. And then he sat down. The room grew still for a moment before Samuel spoke. His voice carried the same calm authority it always had, steady and measured. He thanked Charles for his efforts during the recovery period and acknowledged the importance of keeping the company running smoothly during unexpected challenges. Then he placed the leather binder on the table. Samuel explained that before making any decisions about leadership structure, it was important for the board to understand a few administrative changes that had occurred over the past several months. His tone remained professional, without accusation or frustration. He simply said that the company's attorney had prepared a short review. The attorney seated beside him opened a folder and began speaking in a clear, deliberate voice. Instead of presenting opinions, she presented a timeline. Each document was placed on the table in sequence, accompanied by precise explanations of the changes that had occurred. The first documents were the amended corporate filings Samuel had discovered after returning to work. The attorney explained how certain clauses had expanded Charles's authority beyond what Samuel remembered signing in the hospital. The board members leaned forward slightly, because the differences were clear once they were pointed out. Next came the financial review. The attorney presented the consulting payments that had been authorized under the amended authority structure. She explained how those payments traced back to a consulting entity connected to Charles through a financial partnership. The room grew quieter. Finally, the attorney addressed the timeline of the document drafts themselves. Archived versions of the amended agreements were displayed, showing that the clauses expanding Charles's authority had been written weeks before Samuel's medical emergency. In other words, the changes had been prepared long before they were supposedly needed. The final document reviewed was the medical certification used to justify the authority expansion. The attorney calmly explained that the language in that certification exceeded the physician's original medical assessment. No one spoke while the evidence was presented. There was nothing left to interpret. Samuel sat silently while the attorney finished explaining the findings. His hands rested calmly on the table, his expression unchanged. He had not raised his voice once during the entire meeting. Because the truth did not require anger. When the attorney closed her folder, the room remained completely still. The board members exchanged quiet glances as the full meaning of the document settled over them. What had seemed like a natural leadership transition now looked very different. It looked planned. Charles sat motionless for several seconds, staring at the documents spread across the table in front of him. The confidence he had carried into the meeting had faded, replaced by the slow recognition that the situation had shifted in ways he had not anticipated. Samuel finally spoke again, his voice as steady as it had been at the beginning. He explained that he had spent months reviewing the company's records, ensuring that every detail was understood before raising the issue publicly. His goal was not confrontation but clarity. Because the company deserved the truth. No accusations followed. No dramatic speeches filled the room. The documents themselves had already answered every question that needed answering. And in that quiet moment, something important became clear to everyone present. For the first time, Charles realized something he had never considered during all those months of careful planning. Samuel Whitaker had not forgotten anything. For the first time, Charles realized that Samuel had remembered every single detail. People who betray others often believe that time will protect them. But time does not protect deception, it exposes it. In the weeks that followed the boardroom meeting, the quiet machinery of accountability began moving forward with the same precision Samuel Whitaker had relied on throughout his entire career. The company's compliance officers reviewed the documents presented during the meeting, comparing the amended filings, consulting payments, and authority changes against corporate governance standards. The process was professional and structured. But its implications were undeniable. A formal compliance investigation began almost immediately. The board authorized an external review to ensure every transaction connected to the amended authority structure was examined carefully. Financial records were audited, consulting agreements were reevaluated, and the timeline Samuel had built over months became the foundation for the investigation. Charles Whitaker no longer held operational authority during that process. The control he once exercised quietly dissolved through formal procedure. It did not happen with public announcements or dramatic headlines. Instead, the board implemented the changes the same way Samuel had always managed the company, calmly, methodically, and without unnecessary spectacle. Employees noticed the shift, but there were no emotional confrontations inside the warehouse or office corridors. The company continued operating with the same disciplined rhythm that had defined its culture for decades. Samuel refused every suggestion that the situation should become public drama, because revenge had never been his objective. Several people advised him that exposing Charles publicly might protect the company's reputation more quickly. Others suggested that the story should be shared with local business networks to prevent misunderstandings about what had occurred. Samuel declined every one of those suggestions. He believed the company's dignity mattered more than public vindication. And dignity does not grow through humiliation. Helen supported that decision without hesitation. Through every moment of uncertainty, she had remained the same calm presence she had always been. Her strength had never been loud, but it had always been unwavering. She reminded Samuel that integrity reveals itself over time. And time, she knew, had already begun revealing the truth. Andrew watched the entire process unfold with a mixture of admiration and reflection. The events of the past months had changed the way he understood leadership. Growing up, he had always believed strength meant defending yourself quickly and directly when someone tried to take advantage of you. But Samuel had shown him something very different. Strength, sometimes, means waiting until the truth is undeniable. The investigation eventually confirmed what the boardroom meeting had already suggested. The consulting payments connected to Charles violated the company's disclosure policies, and the amended authority clauses had expanded operational control beyond what Samuel had knowingly approved. Those findings carried consequences. Charles no longer held any position within Whitaker Logistics, and the consulting entity connected to the payments was formally terminated from any relationship with the company. Legal and financial adjustments followed quietly, guided by professional procedures rather than emotional reactions. Samuel never spoke about those consequences publicly. Instead, he turned his attention toward protecting the future of the company he had spent half his life building. Working with the board and his legal advisors, he placed Whitaker Logistics into a protected family trust designed to prevent any similar manipulation from occurring again. The structure ensured that major authority changes would require multiple levels of oversight. Financial transparency procedures were strengthened, and governance safeguards were permanently written into the company's legal framework. The system Samuel created was not about control. It was about protection. Because the lesson of those months was not simply about betrayal. It was about the importance of building structures strong enough to withstand it. Andrew helped review the final documents late one evening as the sun set beyond the warehouse yard. The company trucks were returning from their routes, and the familiar rhythm of operations continued exactly as it always had. Samuel closed the final binder of documents and placed it carefully inside the cabinet where he kept the company's most important records. Andrew looked at his father for a moment before speaking. He asked how Samuel had stayed so calm through everything. Samuel thought about the question quietly. Then he explained something